They say the story of humanity began in the dust, but maybe it began in the stars. Long before kings and empires, before gods had names, there might have been visitors whose science appeared as miracles. Fragments of clay buried beneath Mesopotamian soil still whisper about them, beings who descended from heaven not to bless, but to build. They came for a reason both desperate and divine, to save their dying world by reshaping ours. And in doing so, they may have written the first chapter of human history with their own hands, in flesh and gold. We've spent millennia calling them gods, angels, myths. But what if they were something else entirely? Engineers, colonists, or parents? Between the lines of every ancient tablet and every forgotten ruin lies a possibility so vast it unsettles the soul, that we are the echo of an older creation, a living experiment still unfolding. Tonight, we follow that echo back to its source, to the place where heaven met earth, and where humanity may have been born in a laboratory, not a garden. Welcome to Deformed history. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. There are moments in history when the silence of the earth seems to hide a secret too large to name. Picture this. A quiet museum hall, the air still, the light soft as dust floats through it like slow snow. Behind glass, a small clay tablet, smaller than your hand, sits half broken, its surface covered in neat, wedge-shaped symbols. To most who walk past, it's nothing. A fragment of bureaucracy from a long-dead world. But for those who listen closely, that fragment hums with something stranger, a record, a memory, a witness statement from the dawn of civilization. The Sumerians called their land Ki-en-Gir, the land of the noble lords. The Greeks would later name it Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. And somewhere in that floodplain, where mud met starlight, humanity seemed to appear all at once. Cities, writing, astronomy, law, music. It was as if someone had turned a key in the dark, and a species that once scraped tools from stone suddenly began measuring the heavens. Mainstream archaeology calls it a sudden cultural bloom. But to some, it feels less like evolution and more like intervention. Imagine standing in that ancient landscape 6,000 years ago. The night sky above the ziggurats is thick with stars. Below, torches flicker along canals and temple walls carved with scenes of gods descending from the heavens, carrying tools that glow. They are tall, impossibly so, wearing strange helmets that shine like molten bronze. Their hands hold objects that look nothing like spears or staffs, more like devices. The people kneel before them, not in fear, but in awe. They call them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. And if Zecharia Sitchin's reading of these tablets holds even a fragment of truth, they were not gods at all. They were travelers, colonists, engineers from a dying world. That world, they said, was called Nibiru, a planet with an orbit so long and distant that one of its years equaled 36 centuries of ours. Imagine what that means. Beings for whom 1,000 human generations pass in a single lifetime. To us, immortal. To them, simply patient. Sitchin believed their home was in trouble, its atmosphere leaking into the void like breath from a cracked mask. Their solution was elegant, desperate, and perhaps inevitable. They needed gold. Suspended in microscopic dust across their skies, it could restore the dying veil of their world. And so their gaze turned outward, toward the sun, toward the tiny blue planet that glittered faintly on the edge of their system. Toward us. From here, the story takes a shape both cosmic and heartbreakingly human. A council of beings debates survival. A ruler, Anu, sends his two sons, Enlil, the commander, and Enki, the scientist. They are brothers, rivals, reflections of two opposing instincts, control and creation. Their ships descend in fire over the marshes of what would one day be Iraq. They land at the head of the Persian Gulf, where reeds whisper and the air smells of salt and heat. They call the place Eridu, home in the faraway. Later, archaeologists will dig there and find the oldest known temple on Earth, its bricks baked before history itself began. For the Sumerians, it was the first city. For Sitchin, it was the first colony. Enki leads the first team, 50 explorers, engineers, and scientists. They build structures that shimmer under the strange sun. They filter gold from seawater, harvest minerals from riverbeds, and send glittering cargo skyward in their vessels. But the work is slow, inefficient. Enlil arrives, furious. He sees failure where his brother sees potential. His solution is simple. Dig deeper. They move south to a land the texts call Abzu, where the earth is rich and heavy with veins of gold. Modern eyes know it as Africa. There, beneath the burning sun, they open the planet's first mines. Toiling in those depths are not humans, not yet, but their creators, a lower caste of Anunnaki called the Igigi. They are the laborers, the miners, the forgotten ones. For thousands of Earth years, they work in the dark, their lives stretched across centuries until the years blur into one endless moment of exhaustion. The heat, the pressure, the silence. Eventually they revolt. They burn their tools, storm Enlil's city, surround his palace, the rebellion of heaven's workers, the first strike in the history of existence. And it forces a terrible question. If even gods refuse to serve, who will replace them? In the great hall of Nippur, Enlil rages. The project teeters on the edge of collapse. The mines are silent. Nibiru is dying. Enki listens, quiet, thoughtful, and then he speaks. What if we create a worker? A being born of this planet, strong, adaptable, obedient. Not a god, not quite an animal. Something in between. Something new. His words fall like stones into the silence. What he proposes is nothing less than the rewriting of life itself. The council hesitates. To play with creation is to tempt chaos. But the equations are clear. Without gold, Nibiru dies. Without workers, there is no gold. Desperation overrides fear. And so, in the sterile chambers of their settlement, Enki and his chief geneticist, Ninhursag, the lady of the embryo, begin the work. They study the local species, the upright ape-men who roam the African plains. Homo erectus, resilient, social, curious, raw material, Enki calls them. Clay waiting for a sculptor's hand. From one of these creatures they take an egg. Into it they weave the essence of an Anunnaki, a spark of their own genetic fire. The embryo grows, fails, again and again. The gulf between species is too vast. The host bodies reject the seed. The pregnancies collapse. Finally, Ninhursag volunteers herself as vessel. The first hybrid child is born under artificial light, small, breathing, alive. Enki names him Adamu, the earthling. When Enlil hears, he calls it blasphemy. But when he sees the child, upright, alert, intelligent, something changes. The experiment becomes a program. 14 Anunnaki women carry the next generation, 7 male, 7 female. They are perfect but sterile, designed not to multiply, only to serve. They are brought to the mines of Abzu, given tools, taught words. And there, under alien supervision, humanity begins its first labor. It is not a paradise, it is a contract, and it will change the world forever. The flow of gold resumes. Nibiru's atmosphere stabilizes. The mission is saved. But the quiet between the brothers deepens. Enki looks upon his creation with a strange, forbidden tenderness. Enlil sees only risk, a creature too capable, too aware. "We gave them our image," he says. "But what if one day they remember whose image it is?" In the glare of an alien sun, beneath the hum of ancient machines, a spark has been lit. A spark that will not stay contained. There's a moment in every act of creation when the maker looks upon what they've built and feels something dangerous. Affection. Enki stood in the humid air of the Abzu, watching the first workers haul shimmering dust from the earth. They were strong, tireless, quiet. They obeyed. But there was something behind their eyes now, something that flickered when they looked up at the sky or whispered to one another in the half-language they'd begun to invent. It was not obedience. It was thought. The scientists called it an anomaly. Enki called it a beginning. In Mesopotamia, beneath the blazing sun, cities rose from the mud. Eridu, Nippur, Shurupak, each a command post built by the Anunnaki and maintained by their hybrid servants. From above, it must have looked like clockwork. Irrigation canals glinting like silver veins, ziggurats climbing the horizon, the hum of machines under stone. Humanity was efficient, predictable, but nothing stays perfect forever. The sterile hybrids began to die faster than they could be replaced. Their creators had crafted them without the ability to reproduce, fearing another rebellion. The mines slowed. Production faltered. And on Nibiru, the atmospheric shield began to thin again. The council gathered in the great chamber of Nippur. Enlil's patience was gone. He spoke of control, of quotas, of maintaining order. To him, the human creatures were a tool, replaceable, disposable. Enki saw something else. He had walked among them, had taught them simple words, had seen them laugh. He argued that their sterility was the problem, not the solution. "Let them multiply," he said. "Let them live as we do. They will serve better if they have something to live for." The council erupted. Enlil's voice thundered, "Do you wish to make gods of slaves?" But Enki did not back down. Somewhere deep inside, a sense of guilt or perhaps pride was turning into defiance. That defiance took the form of quiet rebellion. In his laboratories, under the pretense of routine maintenance, Enki made small alterations. Nothing dramatic. Just a sequence here, an enzyme there. Tiny edits to the code of life that would grant the hybrids the one gift they had been denied: the ability to create more of their own. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of faith. He believed that life, once kindled, deserved to continue. One night, Enki walked among the human settlements. He found two of his newest creations, a man and a woman, nearly identical to their creators in form, but smaller, softer, afraid of thunder. He watched them speak to each other in broken sounds, watched their hands meet, watched them look at the stars. He realized then that they were beginning to ask questions, though they didn't yet have words for them. It was inevitable. Curiosity is not taught. it is inherited. And so the legend of the garden began. The garden was not a paradise, but a controlled habitat, a lush biodome near the marshes of Eridu, filled with carefully engineered plants and animals. Within it, the perfected humans lived under strict observation. They worked, they rested. They were fed knowledge only as needed, language for labor, not for philosophy. And at the center of this enclosure grew something forbidden, a cluster of glowing fruit trees, genetically modified flora that symbolized not temptation, but understanding. To eat their fruit was to activate the latent intelligence written into human DNA, to awaken fully. When the woman, whom the texts would later call Ninti, Lady of Life, touched the luminous fruit, Enki was watching. Perhaps he did nothing to stop her. Perhaps he had planned it all along. The spark passed through her like lightning through glass. When she looked at the world again, she saw it differently, saw the patterns in the soil, the motion of the stars, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. And when Enlil discovered what had happened, his rage was biblical. He called it betrayal, he called it sin. He ordered the humans cast out of the garden, forced into the wild to fend for themselves. But Enki saw it as liberation. In the centuries that followed, humanity multiplied. They built huts along rivers, learned to plant and harvest, learned to dream. They painted animals on cave walls they could not name, and buried their dead with shells and stones as if expecting them to wake again. Enlil watched from afar, seething. "They have become noisy," he said. And it was true. The plains of Mesopotamia began to hum with life, with laughter, with chaos. What Enki had given was not just the power to reproduce, it was the seed of self-awareness. The two brothers drifted further apart, their rivalry hardening into doctrine. Enlil believed that humanity must remain subservient, contained, managed. To him, civilization was a leash. Enki believed that knowledge itself was sacred, that the measure of a creator was not control, but what he set free. Each began to act in secret. Enlil sent droughts and diseases, tests to curb the human population. Enki countered with waterworks, medicine, and science. The humans, caught between gods at war, began to weave myths around them, of thunder gods and serpent teachers, of floods and salvation. Every story became an echo of their maker's conflict. Time on earth is a river, but for the Anunnaki, it was a still lake. Their years passed slowly, but even they could feel change stirring. The humans, these fragile experiments, had begun to build altars. They sang to their creators, carved their faces into stone, offered food to the sky. For the first time, Enlil felt something close to fear. If they worship us, he told the council, they will one day imagine themselves worthy of the same. He wasn't wrong. Among the humans, leaders arose, descendants of the first hybrids, taller, stronger, living longer than others. The Anunnaki called them Nephilim, children of the gods. They became kings, priests, and builders. They carried symbols of power, rods that hummed, crowns that glowed, and ruled over their people in the name of their divine fathers. Civilization was blooming again, faster than anyone predicted. The slaves had learned to rule. One evening, Enki stood on a terrace above the marshlands, watching the torches of human settlements flicker across the horizon like stars fallen to earth. He felt both pride and dread. "They are learning too quickly," whispered Ninhursag beside him. He nodded, but his voice was soft. "That's what life does. It learns." Far above, Nibiru's crimson shadow was returning on its long orbit, unseen by any eye but theirs. The sky itself was preparing for judgment. For Enlil, it would be the answer to all his frustrations. A storm so vast it could erase the noise forever. For Enki, it would be the greatest test of his creation. Between them, the fate of humanity hung by a thread of water and time. It began not with thunder, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over the world before something irreversible happens. The Anunnaki watched the skies as Nibiru drew near again on its vast orbit, a crimson wanderer returning after millennia of cold exile. To them, it was a celestial rhythm, an event calculated with perfect precision. To the humans below, it was nothing more than the ordinary turning of the heavens. They didn't know that the stars themselves had begun to move against them. In the cities of Sumer, the nights were restless. The air grew heavy. The animals stirred uneasily. Fishermen on the Persian Gulf spoke of strange tides, of the sea withdrawing farther than they had ever seen. To the priests, it was an omen. To Enlil, it was a prophecy fulfilled. He had warned the council that the human clamor, the noise of their voices, the unending flood of life they produced, would one day drown the silence of the gods. And now, he believed, the universe was answering him. The Anunnaki gathered at Nippur under a trembling sky. Holographic charts projected Nibiru's approach, its gravitational wake a sweeping arc across the solar system. The calculations were merciless. As it passed the southern pole of Earth, its pull would wrench the Antarctic ice loose. A chain reaction would follow, seas rising, storms feeding upon storms until the planet itself groaned under the weight of water. Enlil's proposal was chilling in its simplicity. They would not intervene. They would let the flood cleanse the world. For a moment the council sat in stunned silence. Even among immortals there was fear. But Enlil spoke with the authority of a commander who had long ceased to doubt himself. "We created them," he said, "and we can unmake them. The noise of man has become unbearable." The words fell like iron. Anu, distant in the light of his throne, said nothing. The motion passed. They would retreat to orbit and watch the waters erase the experiment. Only Enki refused. To him, this was not a cleansing, but a crime. Humanity was his creation, his echo, his child. Yet he was bound by an oath, a promise sealed before Anu, that no Anunnaki would warn the humans. For days he wandered the corridors of his city, searching for a way to keep his word and break it at once. Then, one night, he found it. Words, he realized, could be aimed not at people, but at walls. In Shurupak, the city of reeds, there lived a priest-king named Ziusudra, a man of quiet devotion, known for listening more than he spoke. Enki came to his dwelling under the cover of a storm. He did not knock. He pressed his hands to the woven walls of the hut and whispered, "Reed wall, listen to me. Take heed of my words." Inside, the man stirred, half dreaming, hearing a voice that seemed to speak through the walls themselves. "Tear down your house," the voice said. "Build a vessel. Seal it against the waters. Take with you the seed of every living thing." The instructions were exact, mathematical. The boat was to be circular, sealed with pitch and resin, reinforced like a cocoon. It would not sail. It would endure. Ziusudra obeyed. He told his people he was leaving the city to escape Enlil's wrath. They pitied him, not knowing that he was building the future in silence. For months, the vessel grew beside the river like a second temple. Birds nested in its beams. Children laughed as they carried wood for a project none of them would ever understand. Then, one morning, the light changed. The air trembled. In the distance, the sea rose up, not as waves, but as a wall. The sound came later, a low roar that grew into a scream. The Anunnaki had already left the surface. From their ships above, they watched the planet convulse. Mountains vanished, cities dissolved, Eridu, Nippur, all swallowed by the black. Even Enlil, who had demanded the flood, turned away. In orbit, the world was a swirling storm of mud and foam. The ships trembled under the electromagnetic fury of the deluge. Below, a single vessel drifted through the darkness, Ziusudra's ark. Inside, by the light of oil lamps, he held his wife's hand and prayed not to gods, but to the silence that had once been the voice of a god. Outside, the waters climbed higher than memory. When the storm finally broke, weeks or centuries later, the earth was unrecognizable. The seas had redrawn its borders. The air smelled of salt and death. The first sunrise after the flood was weak and colorless, falling upon a world stripped bare. Ziusudra's vessel came to rest against a mountain. He opened its hatch and stepped out into silence. The ground beneath him was slick with new clay. The rivers had not yet chosen their paths. Everything was beginning again. He built an altar and burned a small offering. The smoke rose straight into the thin, new air, carrying with it the scent of life. Far above, the Anunnaki ships detected it, chemical traces of carbon, amino acids, fat, the smell of survival. And something in that signal stirred their hunger and their guilt. The gods smelled the savor, the tablets say. They gathered like flies over the sacrifice. They descended. Enlil was last. When he saw the fire and the man, his anger flared. "Who has survived?" he shouted. Enki stepped forward. "He lives because he listens," he said. "He is proof that mercy still exists." For the first time, Enlil faltered. Around him, the other Anunnaki were silent. They had watched the waters devour their cities, too. They had seen their monuments vanish into mud. The flood had not just erased humanity, it had erased them. In that moment, the brothers made peace. Enlil lifted Ziusudra and his wife by the hand and blessed them. He granted them long life, saying, "You shall dwell where the rivers meet, in the land of Dilmun, where sickness is no more." Humanity would begin again, but smaller, humbler, limited. Enki altered the genetic code once more, shortening their years, dulling their memory of the time before the flood. It was mercy disguised as control. The age of gods walking among men was over. The world had been reset. But something remained. In the quiet of the new dawn, the survivors built fires and told stories of the gods who came from the sky, of the man who built the boat, of a world drowned for its noise. Every myth of flood and salvation that followed, Noah, Deucalion, Manu, was a reflection of that single night when the world held its breath and began again. Above them, in the vast silence of space, Nibiru moved on, its orbit carrying it back into the cold beyond Jupiter. The gods were gone, but their work endured, in clay, in blood, in memory. Humanity had survived not because it was strong, but because one being had dared to whisper to a wall. When the waters finally withdrew, the world that emerged wasn't the same one the gods had drowned. The air smelled of clay and salt. The rivers had carved new paths across the plains. The mountains were stripped to bone. For a time, there were no temples, no songs, only the slow heartbeat of survival. Humanity began again as a whisper, not a chorus. Families gathered around fires, telling stories they barely understood. Stories of light in the sky, of a god who warned them through a wall, of a flood that swallowed everything but memory. The Anunnaki returned to the surface, walking upon the mud they had once ruled from the clouds. Their cities were gone, their machines buried beneath silt. They rebuilt, but not with the same zeal. Something in them had broken. Enlil, once the enforcer, now moved through the ruins like a man haunted by his own echo. Enki wandered the riverbanks, collecting fragments of tablets washed up from the old world, data shards of the civilization that had been erased. He no longer spoke of creation. He spoke of continuity. For the humans, every gesture became sacred. To plant a seed was an act of defiance against extinction. To build a home was to rebuild the world. In the marshes of the Euphrates, new villages rose on the ruins of Eridu. The survivors remembered the gods, but not as they were. They made them larger, stranger, more distant. They sculpted them with wings, gave them thunder in their hands. They did not remember spacecraft or laboratories, only awe. Myth became a mask over history. And yet, the Anunnaki remained among them, guiding quietly, shaping from behind the curtain. They taught irrigation, the counting of time, the laws of the stars. But this time they moved through intermediaries. They would no longer rule directly. Instead, they would crown men, half human, half divine, to govern in their stead. Kingship, they said, descended from heaven. The first king, Alulim, ruled in Eridu for 28,000 years, or so the tablets say. To modern ears, it is nonsense. But for a race whose single orbit around the sun lasted 36 centuries, 28,000 years was only the blink of a cosmic eye. The king lists that archaeologists now pore over, etched in fragile clay, were once ledgers of obedience. Each line, each improbable reign, was a record of the Anunnaki's own administrators, their sons and emissaries, who maintained order in the fragile new world. Only after the flood did those lifespans begin to shrink, as though some invisible code had been rewritten. And indeed, it had. Enki, under pressure from Enlil and the council, altered the human genome once more. The changes were small but devastating. A shortening of telomeres, a dampening of regenerative functions, the careful pruning of cognitive pathways. Humanity would still learn, still build, but never again too fast, never again too far. It was a leash written into the blood. The new civilization bloomed under supervision. The cities of Sumer rose like constellations along the rivers, Ur, Kish, Lagash, each one dedicated to a different god, each one a branch office of a celestial empire, now operating under strict containment protocols. In the temples, priests tended fires that once symbolized engines. They recited hymns that were once log reports. The old machines became sacred relics, their purpose forgotten, but their presence worshipped. And over it all hung the illusion that humanity was finally alone. Yet traces of memory lingered. The myths of the Nephilim, the mighty ones born of heaven and earth, persisted. They were taller, stronger, brighter-eyed than other men. They ruled as kings and warriors, but also as symbols of a lost age when the divine had mingled with the mortal. Across continents, the same archetypes reappeared. The feathered serpent gods of Mesoamerica, the shining ones of Egypt, the white-bearded sages who came after the flood to teach farming and geometry. They were the same story, rewritten in different tongues, fragments of the Anunnaki diaspora echoing through human memory. But Enlil, ever watchful, saw the danger in remembrance. He knew stories had power, that myth could resurrect what history had buried. So he devised a subtler control. The Anunnaki would no longer govern through strength, but through language. They fragmented human speech, scattered tribes, and watched as unity dissolved into rivalry. The people began to fight over the names of gods that once described the same beings. Babel was not a tower, it was a firewall. Over the next millennia, memory softened into faith. The engineers became angels. The administrators became deities. The laboratories became temples. Humanity worshipped what it could no longer comprehend, and in doing so ensured its own containment. Enki's spark of curiosity still burned, but only as a whisper, a question in the dark. Who are we, really? One night, standing at the edge of a reconstructed canal in Eridu, Enki looked into the reflection of the stars on the water. He realized that what they had built would outlive them, not as empire, but as legend. They will forget our faces, he said quietly, but not our names. Behind him, Ninhursag placed a hand on his shoulder. Perhaps that is mercy, she replied. He smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps it is the beginning of something we cannot control. The gods had learned that destruction could not erase memory. It only reshaped it. Humanity, for all its fragility, carried remembrance like a seed buried in the soil. And seeds have a way of growing, even under stone. Millennia passed. The gods became myths. The myths became scriptures, and the scriptures became history. What had once been memory hardened into metaphor, but traces of the old truth still glimmered, buried not in ruins, but in us. Humanity forgot the faces of its makers, yet every cell still whispered their design. Our blood carried their code, our stories carried their shadows. In time, the old world rose again, layer upon layer of forgotten brilliance, from Sumer to Babylon, from Egypt to the Indus, from the high plateaus of South America to the islands of the Pacific. The same patterns reappeared. Pyramids aligned to stars, stones cut with impossible precision, gods who descended from the heavens bringing order and law. The textbooks would call this parallel development. But perhaps it was not parallel at all. Perhaps it was memory resurfacing like a ghost. In Egypt, they built colossal monuments of limestone and granite, their peaks gleaming like mirrors under the desert sun. The Great Pyramid, once wrapped in white casing stones, shone bright enough to be seen from space. The priests said it was a tomb, a stairway for the pharaoh's soul. But if you listen closely to the silence inside, to the resonance of the king's chamber, you can almost hear something else, a hum, a frequency, a design that speaks not of death, but of energy. The air shafts, aligned with the belt of Orion, point not to the heavens of faith, but to the heavens of navigation. The structure itself is less a grave than a machine, a monument of physics disguised as prayer. In the shadow of the Andes, another pyramid rose, at Tiwanaku, the city of the gods. Its avenues mapped the orbits of planets, its courtyards mirrored the solar system. The question persists. How could people who had never seen beyond the naked eye know the architecture of the sky? Some call it coincidence. Others call it inheritance. For those who still follow the Forbidden Chronicle, the answer is clear. These were not separate civilizations. They were branches of one forgotten root. After the flood, the Anunnaki had scattered, seeding knowledge across continents, leaving behind blueprints encoded in geometry and myth. Wherever they went, they left their mark. The winged disk, the sacred bag, the serpent of wisdom. Symbols that modern eyes mistake for art, yet they repeat with mathematical precision across the world, like the signature of a vanished engineer. But time erodes even divine fingerprints. Empires fell, languages twisted, the gods withdrew deeper into legend, and still we searched for them. Every religion, every philosophy, every science was another way of reaching for the same unspoken question. Where did we come from? And why are we here? The Sumerians said we were made to serve. The philosophers said we were made to know. The scientists said we were made by chance. But maybe the truth lies between, created yet evolving, designed yet dreaming. In the modern age, our telescopes turned outward again. Astronomers began to whisper of something strange beyond Neptune, a hidden planet, vast and cold, disturbing the orbits of the outer worlds. They called it Planet 9. Its path was long, its presence inferred from the dance of distant objects. They hadn't seen it yet, but they could feel it tugging on the edge of gravity, like a ghost. Zecharia Sitchin had named it long before they found the math. Nibiru, the wandering home of the gods, the missing piece of the cosmic puzzle, returning on its slow path through the dark. Meanwhile, biologists turned their gaze inward, to the code of life itself. They mapped the human genome and found something peculiar, an ancient fusion at the core of our DNA. 2 chromosomes merged into one. In every other primate, there are 24 pairs. In humans, only 23. The fusion is flawless, symmetrical, deliberate. Mainstream science calls it a random mutation. But to others, it is a signature, a weld, not an accident. The mark of the engineers who stitched the divine spark into primitive clay. Even the so-called junk DNA, once dismissed as useless, hums with strange patterns, repeated sequences, dormant codes, loops that seem to wait for a command. What if it isn't junk at all? What if it is memory, sleeping? The blueprint of a consciousness far older than our own, written in the very atoms of our blood. Perhaps that's why we dream of the stars, why every culture looks upward and calls the night sky home. Somewhere deep in our design is a longing that no earthbound life should feel, a yearning for something beyond, a call to return. Maybe it isn't imagination, maybe it's a recall. And so history bends in a circle. The gods became myths, the myths became symbols. The symbols became questions, and the questions now lead us back to telescopes pointed at the darkness, to laboratories decoding the ghost lines of our chromosomes, to the quiet suspicion that the story isn't over. If Nibiru exists, if the cycle holds true, then one day, far beyond our calendars, the red planet will return. Whether as salvation or judgment, no one can say. But the old tablets whisper of the rhythm, 3,600 years, one orbit, one breath of the gods. Perhaps they will find us as we found them, searching, longing, half forgotten. Perhaps they will see that their creation has learned to ask the same question they once did. How do we survive the silence between worlds? For now, the universe keeps its secrets. The stars remain indifferent, the soil still hums with buried data, and our blood still carries a code written by hands we no longer remember. But when the night grows still and the sky burns red at the horizon, listen carefully. You might hear a whisper in the static of the wind, a language older than any tongue. The voice of the makers calling through time. And if you listen long enough, you might realize the truth that has haunted humanity since the first spark leapt from stone. We were never gods, and we were never alone.